Hello, and welcome to another edition of For the Love of Creatives podcast. I am your co host, Dwight, joined by our other co host, Maddox. And today we have a special guest, Mico Rodriguez. He is some Dallas restaurant royalty. I could not give him an introduction that would do him justice. So, Michael, why don't you tell our listeners about yourself?
Well, thanks for making me feel special, and I'm honored to be on your broadcast. Uh, Born and raised in Dallas, been in the business all my life. I had no choice. Uh, my mother was a big influence because I worked for her for many years. We had a restaurant, and I grew up at Mia's on Lemon Avenue. So I knew at a very young age that this was what I was going to do. And even though the holidays and the 7 days a week, and uh, uh, it still intrigued me. I was When I'd go to restaurants, I'd look at lighting, I'd look at the floors, I'd look at and I was 17 years old, only because this is the way I wanted to live my life. I wanted to be in a restaurant, and my dream was to have only one restaurant. That would have sufficed for sure.
Well, you certainly surpassed that in spades.
And there's a lot I left in between, but I'm sure we'll get around to some of that.
Yeah, it sounds like it kind of took on a life of its own, didn't it?
You know what? It did create. My mother did create uh, uh, a restaurateur, and it was maybe I didn't recognize it at the time, but even today, I hear my mother's voice inside my head. So a privilege and tough because my mother was a very uh, believed in being old school, a dictator, a tyrant when those times came. But we were working. My mother had a busy restaurant, and we're working as a family, which is the highs are high, the lows are low. But when I dream restaurants, I dream that restaurant. So
Mico,
very
what
special.
year was did your mom open that restaurant?
1980.
1980. And for those that don't know, it's a very prominent restaurant in Dallas. It still exists. It moved here a couple of years. No, it's been more than that. Probably been 5 or 6 years now. It moved to a new location. Is it still part of your family?
Yes, my sister, my mother passed. My dad had passed several years ago. Um, she inherited the restaurant, and they actually moved from one side of Chipotle to the other side of Chipotle, which was fortunate for them because they kept their client, they kept their customer. They have a very loyal customer, and when you walk into the restaurant, it feels like Mamma Mia. Mamma Mia had a distinct vibe and a distinct way of doing things. So, but she was consistent. And to be successful in this business, you've got to be consistent, not just with the food, but with the process and the behaviors and representing the brand.
So that restaurant's now 80, no, 45 years old
Unbelievable.
and still going strong. So how
Yes.
old were you when you started helping out in the restaurant?
Oh, I was 5. My parents
Oh,
worked for El Chico. It was 1962. And well, every now and then you might see a car on Sunday in Dallas. Maybe not. So things were a lot different. But I would go to work. My dad would pay me $1 an hour, and I'd work 3 hours. So that was I was in a good place. I felt at peace, believe it or not, in a restaurant. It felt very comfortable for me. And of course, my parents, they worked morning, noon, and night, and even for the other company. So El Chico, who they worked for, fabulous company in the 60s, really was a blueprint for Mi Cocina. And it was owned by the Cuellar family. But the Cuellar family loved my mom and dad because they were good for the bottom line. And my parents were turnaround artists. They'd come in, put a little pixie dust in a restaurant that wasn't operating well, and they would turn it around. And that's a special thing because it's hard to have that you. You know, you're at the bottom of the U, and it's hard to get up again. Um, but resilience and perseverance and um, never stop doubting. They never really thought that they were going to fail because one guest at a time, if you make the children, they'll bring the parents. And like I said, you know, the commitment. And my parents were together every day for 40 years.
Hmm.
And even that is an accomplishment. But
Yes, it is.
my mother was definitely the boss. My dad, well, he just surrendered because when they got successful, um, they started traveling a little bit, and I would always stay at the restaurant. So, and my dad, you know, it was a 12 table restaurant, 24 table restaurant that was packed all the time. And of course, Dallas had fewer Mexican restaurants. And they just, well, they loved their customers.
Mhm.
And I think that was really what kept them going. There's so many stories that I haven't heard, and some I've been hearing lately that I had no idea. And it's special. It's special. I had a gentleman that let me know he was in the radio business and he was producing films. Um, and he said to me, you know, I'm going to tell you something. In the 80s, I was going through a very, very sad divorce. And so I would go to Mia's, I'd be by myself, and your mother would always soothe me. And we would talk and share. And I just want you to know that I'm very grateful that I had her in my life. And I had no idea, no idea. So those are the special things that either are said or unsaid. But my mother never, she never said, well, we talked about this or we talked, she kept it private,
Yeah.
which, which, you know, it's easy, but to share that, but she felt like that was a moment that she had, and she had a lot of respect um, for the gentleman. But that was nice to hear.
You know, Mico, that she probably, there are more stories like that than you can begin to imagine and that you will never hear because you've already said that's who she was. That
Uh-huh.
he wasn't the only one she did that with, for sure.
Oh no,
So
she
you,
did it
you
with.
spoke, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, she did it with me because she planted a seed, and you know, I have two people in my life really that said to me, Mico, you're going to make it, and that was my mother and Carolyn, my wife, father, who I was very close to, and they never gave up. They always said, "You're going to be fine. You're going to have." All I wanted was one restaurant, and when I got to be 30, I got my 20s out of the way. I'd gotten control of my alcohol and cocaine addiction, and I've had addiction probably since the age of 11 when I ate 2 bags of Chips Ahoy cookies. And so I knew that something wasn't quite correct. But I've had well, I'm bipolar. I'm pretty sure I'm ADD. I'm sure I don't know what else, but I know that above all, I'm a good man, and I feel good about this. That I feel comfortable in my skin. In my 20s, the drinking and the drugging and working in a restaurant kind of went hand in hand to a lot of people. And so, but I always made it to work. And it's because I wanted to be there and I didn't want to miss anything. And it was a busy restaurant. I made whatever I made, I lived like if I had a different lifestyle because of Mamma Mia. So, that was nice. But we were, very moderate people. I mean, we didn't have anything extravagant or anything, but we had the commitment to the business and our guests. And it was our lives. It really was our lives. If I dream, it has, well, let's say this. I never had, if it's a backyard barbecue, not really. If it's a family vacation, not many. But, when you celebrate everything at a restaurant, then birthdays or whatever, then you never get to be at home. So my mother, for 10 years, she worked 7 days a week. Hmm. And as I got older, and went through the experience of Mia's, I realized that that's the choice she made because she felt safe, secure, and she didn't have to deal with everything except things that she could accomplish. She could run a restaurant, but I realized that it was difficult sometimes for her, to be, I don't want to say normal, but to be more conventional. And I found myself duplicating a lot of that. And so it affected me because she was probably the most influential. And when I left Mia's, my brother says that I changed history. Um, I walked out of Mia's because my mother was telling me um, a certain way to live. And I finally said, well, it's to myself, it's time for me to get out of mama's skirt. And started walking down Linden Avenue, and my brother, Paul, um, who's very creative and artistic, my biggest influence, he ran outside and he says, Mico, don't leave. And he said to me, you're going to change history. And I had no idea that Mi Cocina was going to happen. I had no idea. Like I said, I got a, when we opened Mi Cocina, it was basically Mia's North. But my cousin and I had contributed a lot. My cousin Ernest contributed a lot to the menu of the restaurant of Mia's. So I literally opened up Mia's North. So it was quite controversial. Uh, my mother never gave up connecting with me, but my dad didn't. We didn't speak for a couple of years, and I didn't go back to Mia's for 9 years. So yeah, it took a toll on my relationship with my family. But even with my family, Caroline and Chris, my son Chris was. We all got married the same day because she had Chris from a previous marriage, and they were willing to sacrifice not ever seeing me because literally I made some choices my mother made, and that was almost truly sad, just sad for me because there was a time when I felt like my restaurant came first. And a regret, yeah, a growing experience and appreciation that I've gotten to this moment right now. I'm very grateful and have a lot of gratitude because I have taken it to the edge a few times and it took a long time to get here.
Your energy tells me that's true, that you're in a very good place. The day I met you, I immediately recognized a man with great wisdom and great humility. Great humility.
Well, my mother said, always be humble. And I never really, a lot of people define that word differently. And they think, some people might think it's submissive, or some people might think that it's the best thing they like about themselves. So, um, and she also said that I would ask her, I said, Mama, what do you want for your birthday? And she would say, just give me peace of mind. And my experience tells me that all our life we struggle looking for peace and serenity because you're either off to the races, creating a life for your family, working, occupied, and you surrender a lot of those things that maybe you wish you had. And so you're living your life really kind of through your guest. Because as a server, I realized that listening was important. And when people would talk about trips and travel and meals and fashion, and it's not like I intentionally overheard, although sometimes it was hard not to, but I didn't get that interaction at that level. We're families, that's not what we did. Um, so I always appreciated that. I always appreciated to see people share a meal and actually talk about the day, talk about the weekend, talk about the trips. And so, but it really made me curious and it really broadened. I say, people say, well, where'd you get your education? I say, in the dining rooms. And that's really what it was, working with my coworkers and then listening in the dining room.
Mico, can I offer a different perspective?
Yes, please.
And it's just a possibility. You know your life better than anybody, but you have made references several times to guests. But your story tells me that the way you listened to these people, the way you took interest in their lives, that they were not guests, they were your family. They literally were your family. And I get that. I was a career hairdresser for 40 years, and my clients became my family. Now, it may not have been the family that you chose and a wife and then had kids, but I suspect part of the reason that your mother spent as much time at the restaurant as she did was because that was where she felt the most loved. And
Yes.
where you probably felt the most loved because you had nurtured those relationships to the degree that they were no longer guests.
Yeah, and you went through their highs and their lows and you felt it. You're trying to be familiar, not too familial, but it's hard, especially when they look at you as a, an extension of the family or a family friend. Because I'm, essentially an important thing, serving something that's substance that people need to nourish. And to me,
No,
it's a very intimate thing.
but you had an element, you and your mom both, of nourishing that had nothing to do with food.
Well, it was a little self-serving because we were, I think we were medicating, listening and seeing other people's lives that, well, we're not like that, but we're happy. But maybe we could be like that someday. And, every family has, of course, the ordeals and the struggles. But that was my point of reference. And so even when we got home, we would talk about the Joneses or the Richards or, and how idyllic their life felt, uh, that you perceived. And they were interesting. And I was fortunate enough that we were surrounded by interesting people and people that were willing to share some wisdom. And I paid attention. I did do that. But I had I had sometimes you need to expand, your wardrobe of um, of knowledge and of sharing. My brother Paul was probably the biggest influence as far as culture. And first time I heard the word avant-garde, what does that mean? And so my brother at 18 traveled to Europe by himself, and I didn't understand that, and I felt fear for him, or not fear, but scared that something could happen to him. I was 13 and he was 18, and 5 or 6 years is a huge difference. When he's 24, you're 18. And so there are huge differences. Although we became really brothers and very close, uh, in the end, we were estranged because he passed. Um, but he was such a big influence. He taught me, wait a minute, there's a big world out there. There are far more interesting people, people that are accomplished, people that are artists. And I do believe we're all artists. Um, but he really gave me that dream that I was worthy, that I could learn and talk about things that people in my class weren't talking about. So I realized, as being exposed to my brother in the restaurant business, yeah, that I was maybe a little bit more mature, maybe I was a little bit more worldly, and even though I'd never traveled, but um, I lived my life, and through my guests and my brother, um, he always said to me, because he had, well, he never really, he loved beautiful people, and beauty to him, whether it's male or female, was something from the inside and something from the outside. And whenever I never asked him a question um, about uh, his sexuality, but it influenced me in a way that I would hear things from other people. And of course, I was a little bit confused, young. I didn't know. We shared the same bedroom. I didn't know why they're making fun of my brother. Um, but I learned how to deal with it. And it was more or less my brother expanded. He goes, Mico, I love beautiful people. And I still hear those words. And he did. And he was a hairdresser for many, many years. And like you say, interesting guest and interesting clients. So I got to hear about them. Plus, I got a good deal on haircuts, but a big influence in my life.
I know that you mentioned how in the restaurant you grew up with your mother having 7 days a week, for 10 years straight, never going outside of it, and you kind of inherited that same drive, that same tenacity. Yeah, the restaurant became first.
Well, I didn't know how to do it, so I went when the first week we opened. Every time, I said we're going to do this or let's try this, I would quickly, look behind me because I was going to be overridden, and my mother wasn't there. It was
Mm.
just a learned behavior of hearing her voice, and um, you could say one could say that, well, you felt like maybe you were lacking in your mother's attention or your mother's love, but she did what she knew how to do, and that was life experience. And when I realized, after opening a couple of restaurants, well, more than a couple, that I didn't feel comfortable being the person she was. And I had a family, and the success was beyond my wildest dreams. Um, Juanita Miller walked into um, my first restaurant, and that neighborhood had launched us. And I was very, very appreciative. And there was that codependency as far as, well, Mico's there, or the food's good, or they're open late, or um, and we were there to serve. But a woman told me, a lady friend said, Mico, I love you, but I don't have the as much love as you need. So there was a certain emptiness that I was lacking. And I chose to put, well, food and work ahead of everything else. I talked about my addictions. And during the 90s, in 1989, 1988, I've known Carolyn all my life. And we became very close. And one day I asked her to marry me. And I said, why would I want this man to marry my sister when I was I was doing drugs, I was drinking, but I worked every day. My mother would hand that to me, um, but I needed to be a better man, and so I got alcohol and drug free, and I started working a program that through the years I was committed to, and some years I backtracked from, not managing my personality or my behaviors. And so I decided then that I needed to be alcohol and drug free or not ask her to marry me. But she went through this, let's say, life changing experience with, uh, I was speaking earlier of Juanita Miller, who owned Highland Park Village.
Mm-hmm.
Highland Park's downtown, but it's also Dallas's Rodeo Drive.
Right.
And I knew then that how did how did we get here? And my mother and I always had an agreement that, well, okay, it's Mia's North. That kind of went up unsaid, but I don't want you to come below Lover's Lane. No, Northwest Highway. And I said, that's good, Mama. Because even when things got tough, she didn't forget about Carol and I were newly married. And so things were tough, and she was always considerate of that. But I went to the phone because, well, here I was looking at an opportunity that a lot of people wanted. I'd heard about it, but I never thought that the village would be available or available to me. And so I called Mama, and I said, this was actually, I remember, because it was one of my first cell phones, maybe. But it was one of those flip phones. And I said, Mama, Miss Miller's here. So she knew what that meant. And I said, Mama, she wants me for the village. And there was another long pause. And the whole time I was thinking about our agreement, and I had committed to it. And she said, you have to do it. So here I go. By that time, I referenced this. After we got busy at Highland Park, I visited Mexico City for the first time. And I went with some dear friends who had lived there. And I saw glamour, style, fashion, history, a Mexican in every color, and uh, a whole different point of view as far as design. Uh, Luis Barragan became a big influence, and when we did uh, when we did Ventry, you could see, you walked in and there was this curved brick wall. They called it Pepto Bismol pink.
Hmm.
Now, I didn't see Pepto Bismol pink. I thought it was graphic, it was architectural, and it had a purpose. But the restaurant definitely was in a different direction. And I had worked with, fortunately, I'd worked with Zero Three, who who did Baby Ruth in Dallas. That was one of my favorite restaurants, design wise. And so I was very fortunate. I walked into their office, and we were all the same age. And find out till later. But I was sitting down, and they were at an oval table. I think the Sarah table, because I asked. But it was a beautiful table, and not knowing that for the next probably 30 years, we were going to design beautiful restaurants, be a part of it, have a great experience, travel together, have those moments of sincerity, and when maybe I need some advice. And I learned a lot. And I brought to them my restaurant part of, so it was a very good relationship. People will say now, I had an interview where somebody said, what was the most important thing uh, that you and Zero Three, Paul and Jan, were at the same table? And I look at Paul, and he looks at me, and I said, our relationships, because we were truly, we cared about each other. We cared about what we produced. Disagreements, yes. Did I learn how to surrender? Yes. But I also learned a lot about design, and I was very intrigued by it. And I realized that I had a point of view that was different. Mexico City had heavily influenced that because I'd never traveled, and I thought I saw sophistication, and I saw glamour that you don't see here with, you're either a Mexican national or you're what we call Chicano. And a Chicano is um, someone that more than likely has Indian in their blood and darker. And we were here before um, Texas was Mexico, or the nation of Aztlan. And so we tended to be, as we assimilated into the American culture, it was half and half. You know, if culinarily and culturally, um, the Mexican national felt like superior. And this was the 60s, even the 70s, felt superior, especially when you couldn't speak the language correctly. And and let's say they were educated people, there was a certain kind of I don't want to say racism, but superiority. So my version of that was that my parents would take sometimes the cooks home, um, and so I related to them. But there were rancheritos, people from the farm, and being in Mexico City just changed my whole perspective. And certain guests will tell me that they can see the difference, and that has really, really been a privilege in my life. And designing a restaurants with a point of view and representing one of the best compliments I think I've ever received was from a guest. He said, Mico, the way your restaurants are the way I want to live.
I can relate. I
So,
I've been to a couple of your the restaurant concepts, and I just know that the feeling that I got walking into a Mi Cocina was it was a place that had a certain charm and elegance.
and people cared for each other.
Mm.
Our staff, people that didn't belong in our culture, they would get weeded out, not by management, a lot of it by staff in a subtle way. But, and unfortunately, there were some people that didn't want to care. And so we developed a culture that um, we called it La Escalera, the ladder. You came in with no experience. You started washing dishes. You became a busboy. Guess what? You learned 10 words: enjoy, what do you like to drink, what do you like to eat, and thank you very much. And you made a very good living. But sometimes those, well, every time we had only in house growth, we would prepare people for management. And it was tough. Some of my managers couldn't spell, but they would take care of guests, they would clean the restaurant, they would take their employees, care for their employees, and they would make them taller, build them up, because that's the way we wanted to do it. And like I said, El Chico was that big influence as far as the foundation and the platform and the way it was in the 60s. It was like a family. And at one time, it was 90 restaurants. Some of those were franchises. I knew all this before it was 10. That's how curious I was. And not knowing that there were five brothers that owned El Chico. And I was 1962. I was serving waters and I was 3 by 3. And I would be so nervous, you know, in the beginning. Um, and one day somebody said, the brothers are coming. Okay. Ah, the brothers that I've heard about. Um, and when I saw them, I'd always wanted to be. My dad was in management, my mother was a cashier. And so I said, that's what I want to do. And when everybody was saying the brothers are coming, and I saw, it was like seeing beautiful Arabian horses. They had custom cowboy boots and they all wore hats. And they were treated with much respect. And they treated their people with respect. Um, and but there was a certain dignity. And I decided then I want to be one of those guys. Um, because and again, because they were so revered, not knowing that, well, that success would come with that, and not knowing beyond my wildest dreams that that would even come close to that, because Mi Cocina won't ever happen again in Dallas. And but it was a blue, but it was made possible. A lot of it was made possible by El Chico and what I learned there. And so I started absorbing this at 5 years old, which naturally made me more curious. But everybody I went to school with says, Nico, you know, you were pretty consistent. In first grade, you wanted to own a restaurant. In fifth grade, you know, a sophomore, that's all you wanted to do was own a restaurant. So true. But like I said, I never thought that there would be happiness, celebration, sadness, um, losing some of your dignity, um, and joy, not enough joy. at least with my family. I always kind of felt like I'm the one that's different. Okay, there's 30 Mexican kids and one Anglo teacher from Park Cities, and she shows up every day. And I felt like, wait a minute, um, I'm not the same. I always felt uncomfortable in certain situations. And it was again because the wait staff, the busters, they were my friends. And so um, it was difficult. It was difficult growing up, lower middle class, and not wanting for things. Or my mother would be a good provider, my dad, and they worked very hard. But and at that time, it wasn't really financially; it was more or less culturally. Um, my vocabulary was a little broader, and I loved to read in class, and I was a good student, and at that time, and but I didn't feel I felt different than my friends, and I didn't realize it, but I should have felt fine with that. I shouldn't have felt abnormal or not normal. I should have been comfortable. But I've spent a lifetime, feeling comfortable in my own skin. People think, well, um, you're Mico. People, and I would consider, I'm a minor celebrity in Dallas because I've served a lot of people, tacos, enchiladas, rice, and beans. And I've done it in zip codes that were perceived as extremely fortunate. And so, um, not knowing that I was going to live in the same neighborhood. And again, not feeling so comfortable. It got to a point where, after we'd been in business, that I realized, and it took a while, that I didn't belong in 75205. I didn't belong with my friends in the kitchen. So I was like I was suspended. And I made a decision to go to Europe by myself. And that was probably a life changing experience. But I didn't fit in. And remember, I told you about that kid that felt like he didn't quite fit in. So it's almost like that, all those emotions and feelings that I had felt as a child now, even, and you could say the success and the people loved you, and uh, uh, people held you in high regard. Um, that I would feel different, but I have to be honest, I didn't. And so I looked for other things, and one of them was I'm going to build restaurants because restaurants, they love me back, and this is what I do. And um, I realized then, so the thought came to me once that, well, maybe I am looking for these projects and restaurants, and then to to find that what I'm searching for. And one day, and this was there were different times and different places, but we had adopted a little girl named Bianca Elena, and um, of course she doesn't remember this, but I spent a lot of time with her when I could, and um, her life experience very different than anyone I knew or grew up with. But we were fortunate. And she was a little girl. She was always well behaved, and she was a diner. We could take her to a restaurant and with pasta and truffles, and she would scrape the truffles. forget the pasta, forget the pasta. And we could take her to any restaurant. And um, she must have been about 6 or 7. And we had 5 lines, telephone lines at home, which was like the glass house. We were never by ourselves, and we were never the restaurant conversation always, and phone calls and stress and things that go wrong. At that time, I had a habit of grabbing the phone and slamming it down and feeling normal.
Hmm.
And so I would be short. There were times I was very proud of myself. There was a lot of times that I had shame. I had shame. And because of my certain behaviors, I was so driven that I thought, it was going to end and I had to have things this way. And I wish I would have listened more. But at the same time, people could say, well, describe Mico in one word. Some people would say, heart.
Hmm.
And that was like, I never had thought about that. I never had thought. So that was new to me, that someone would think that. Driven, focused, consistent, curious, in search of, yes. But to say heart was another ballgame.
Mico, you have said that you were different, and I agree with you completely. I think you're quite different. And I also think that's what makes you an extraordinary man.
Well, thank you for that compliment. But I think you know how I feel about both of you. I felt very comfortable. I felt genuine. And, um, you know, quickly when you said, well, I'd like for you to appear with us, I said, sure. I didn't even think about it. And so uh, this experience as well, I think it's gone like I imagined. I don't know. I think we have 3 hearts that beat similarly,
Yes.
and,
Yes.
and so it's good because when you're around it, it just nurtures you. You create, you're more alive.
I
And
feel a definite connection with you. Our podcast is all about creativity and community, and your story depicts this in a way that is just breathtaking. You talked about the collaborations with the partners, and they weren't just collaborators and they weren't just partners, they were close friends, people that you loved. You talked about all of the people that worked in your restaurants and how much they were family. I mean, this is a rare story and such a gorgeous story.
that
And
was
you and mom, you said in the very beginning, it really stuck with me. You said, Mom just sprinkled pixie dust. And I kept wanting to ask, oh, tell me more about that pixie dust. I want to know more. But throughout the whole conversation, you did. There was pixie dust sprinkled through every aspect of your story and the way that you related and the people that would come in that didn't even speak English and you would start them washing dishes and before long they're managing a restaurant. So for those that don't know, he and these partners, these collaborators built this to, correct me if I'm wrong, 22 Mi Cocina locations.
we were at 25 and we closed a few, but not many. Um, and uh, I was the CEO, and like I said, there were 2 managers sitting in front of me when we did Highland Park, and I said, "Well, whatever we're going to learn together." And one of those gentlemen has 8 restaurants today, which I'm very, very proud of for him.
Mico, do you have any idea how many lives you have impacted?
Well, I do now that
I mean, from the people who worked for you to the people who you served.
well, you remember I told you about my mother had always told me be humble. So I didn't want to see myself as any different, even though I had been in places and done things I never thought. And my employees, people that I worked with weren't exactly exposed to that. So, so I would share things with them, and because they would ask me questions, and so I felt a responsibility, but I also felt like I didn't want to be arrogant. You know, one of the articles that D Magazine, and they wrote a lot of wonderful articles. Wick Allison, who was the owner, was a dear friend, and um, they said they described me as the timeline of Mexican food in Dallas in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Well, I was almost an expert because I could give you names, locations, and restaurants of the most influential Mexican restaurants in Dallas and what age they were. So it was always like Pete Dominguez at Casa Dominguez, Mariano at Mariano's, I'd always revered. And I thought, well, maybe someday when I have my restaurant, people will like me. And they're like, well, we do. And I didn't want to seem that way. So I think I came off as somewhat vulnerable. And I think it was self induced because I didn't want to see myself different. Even though we had created something that was very special, I wanted to be part of the family. I didn't want to be the tyrant or dictator
That
of
is what makes you extraordinary right there. That's it in a nutshell. Right there, that vulnerability and that humility.
um, and then getting to enjoy the process as while we were growing. uh, our mantra was, or the behavior was, if somebody is new and I walk into a restaurant, I want to meet them.
Mm.
And it wasn't for any other reason, because I had confidence that whoever hired them, mistakes were made, saw something in them or after speaking to them. And so I would literally walk up and I would say, you are blessed. God has brought you here. You're in a special place and you're a special person. And I want to welcome you. And sometimes they would say, who are you? Oh, yeah, I know who you are. Well, but I felt good that I could be genuinely feel that way, because I felt like, we were special in that God held us in his hand. And it started actually with my partners. Caroline, my first partner, but my partners, who I was very close to, still own the company, Mi Cocina. I always felt like we were held in God's hands. And I always gave them, felt like, well, they contributed, and this was the way it was supposed to be. Because one of my partners, I called him up and I said, looking for some advice. I'd never fundraised. This is the first Mi Cocina. And he picks up the phone. Very entrepreneurial guy, business guy, high profile guy now. He said, um, he said, well, let's talk about it. So in 5 minutes, he said, I'll be your partner, not knowing that he was interested. I had overheard him in the restaurants, and we had a nice relationship. And um, and he said, I'll be your partner. And I said immediately, I need to tell you something. What? I'm an alcoholic. And he says to me, "Well, are you drinking now?" I said, "No, I haven't drank in a number of years." And he said, "Okay, we'll get to work." The original investment in the first Mi Cocina was $27,500. And I felt like, to me, it could have been like $10 million, because how do I pay my partners back? Well, with being humble, being tenacious, being um, tough on yourself and tough on other people, because I felt like maybe they were capable of more.
Oh, I could listen to this story for another 2 hours, but out of respect for our listeners, I think we need to wrap it up. This has been absolutely amazing, and maybe we need to have a part two.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
I love
that
that.
would be
I'll probably
great.
be better at it. But again, I have to tell you that both of you make me feel comfortable. And I know that the tender heart, um, you know, they recognize each other.
Yes, they do.
Yes.
Yes, they do. This has been an amazing story. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've enjoyed this.
Yes.
Before we wrap up, Dwight's got three rapid fire questions for you.
For some rapid fire answers.
Is it one word or just, well, we'll make it rapid fire.
It's
Yeah,
just
well,
whatever comes up.
Okay.
right. So, first question. What's one restaurant concept you've always wanted to create but haven't yet?
R&D,
Okay.
which is a cross-cultural American.
Oh,
And I call it, well, I've read cross-cultural exchange, which is our country.
love that.
Love that. Yes.
Next question. If you could cook dinner for any three people, living or dead, who would they be?
Who would they be? Well, one would be Karl Lagerfeld. One would be mm, my great grandmother.
Oh,
And then maybe, well, certainly my wife, but maybe someone like Elon Musk,
okay.
another political figure, maybe,
Yeah.
but certainly my great grandmother.
That's beautiful. Final rapid fire question. What's the most unusual source of inspiration you've found for a restaurant design?
A shoe and a bag. At Highland Park, we were surrounded by some of the greatest fashion.
Yes.
And so I would always share, look at this, look at this, the wonderment of it all. You see that fur coat? It's probably worth thousands of dollars. And of course, it was July, but it's Dallas.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would take a shoe even now and see, picture the restaurant and how does that shoe fit? And so Manolo Blahnik or Louboutin or whatever that was, I would see how it fit, the colors and everything, the craftsmanship. And then the same thing with the bag. An Hermes bag, is it transitional? Does it play along? Can I take it there afternoon, late afternoon, early dinner, and late night? So food, it's always been fashion somehow,
You
somewhat.
you certainly have had an extremely creative life. But the one thing that stands out, and this is a term we use, may not be your term, but what I have heard throughout this is that one of the main things that you created was people magic.
Yes.
You know, uh, it's true because I witness it. I get to hear from them or see them, and there's always fun things to talk about and great memories.
I can imagine. Well, Mico, thank you so much. This has
Well,
just been amazing.
Yes. It's been magic.
thank you for allowing me to share, and bless the both of you for doing what you do, because I think it has um, value and meaning and purpose.
Thank you.